Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. Kate, what about the defense side of this? You've argued that the United States is facing a new world of security threats, needs to get back to something like the Cold War defense buildup. And yet here we are again with potentially another continuing resolution already passed by the House, now going over to the Senate and kicking that debate into 2024.
Yeah, and I think it can be tempting to wonder why continuing resolutions even matter. And I think the Pentagon is one example of where the real damage is concentrated. One issue that you have is that you're just extending last year's funding levels. And so you're not reorganizing to new priorities. And you don't have any inflationary bump. So in the Pentagon, for instance, you start burning your readiness accounts quickly. You have to pay salaries. And so frontline readiness starts to be a bill payer pretty fast. You also slow down the contracting process. The Pentagon is so accustomed to operating on a continuing resolution at this point that it now just rams a lot of its contracting into the later parts of the year, knowing that it's going to wait for full year funding. But most substantively, we've been having this national conversation about how we don't have enough of our best weapons, that we're struggling to supply Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan, or that we're not going to be able to produce enough to help all three of them. We now are going to pass a continuing resolution that will make it harder to do that. It all depends on the length of the continuing resolution about how much damage is done, of course. So I will say the Air Force has said about going to a full year continuing resolution, which Republicans don't want to do, but sometimes it could still happen. On a full year continuing resolution, the Air Force is trying to bump up the production of a very long range weapon called JASSM to 810 missiles a year from 550. But they won't be able to do that if they get stuck on a CR. They won't be able to buy 500 more small diameter bombs. Some of those we've been sending to Israel are very relevant to the fight that they are facing. In the Navy, for instance, sometimes these continuing resolutions will include exceptions for projects like our nuclear triad, the Columbia submarine, for that work to continue. But then there are other ships that get stuck and have to wait for a full year appropriation. So it really does wreak havoc on how the department operates. And if we really think that we have a problem and we need to start addressing our weapons inventories so that they don't run out in, say, a week of fighting in the Taiwan Strait, this just holds everything steady. It just treads water at best. And it's really a problem, just wasting more time getting after the urgency of that problem.
Kim, where do you see the spending negotiations going from here? Those deadlines in January and the first days of February are not that far away on the legislative calendar. One thing also that could be interesting is that those are around the time that voters in these early states start voting in the 2024 primaries. And so candidates out on the campaign trail, Donald Trump, you can name one, will, I would guess, be asked the question, what should Republicans do on these spending fights in the House, in the Senate? He may share those on the campaign trail, or he may share them on Truth Social. But what is going to change between now, when Republicans are having trouble even getting the rules passed for these appropriations bills, and these deadlines that are coming faster than I think Speaker Mike Johnson would probably like?
Absolutely. The pressure now really ramps up on Johnson, especially because he came out this week and said, look, we're passing this CR, but there will be no more short-term spending extensions. We'll see if he can stick to that, because as you note, when you look at the calendar, those days really aren't that far off, especially given that a number of the days between now and then are holidays for Congress because they want to be back in their districts. And obviously Thanksgiving and Christmas are coming up. I would laugh and point out that probably the largest reason that this CR passed yesterday is that the House has been in session for 10 weeks and is tired and wants to go home. That's usually why things happen in Washington. But there's a couple of big things that need to happen, what are called the four corners of the Senate and the House, meaning the top two appropriations chiefs in the House and in the Senate, Democrat and Republican, need to come together and agree on some top line numbers for these bills, because that's another problem that the House and the Senate have, is that The House has been passing bills that come in at an even lower level than what was agreed to back when Kevin McCarthy and Joe Biden agreed to a debt ceiling agreement back in the spring. They've wanted to cut spending even further. The Senate, by contrast, not only has come in at the numbers negotiated in that deal, but have used a bunch of tricks and accounting gimmicks to plus up those bills even higher. So even when these guys manage to get together, which hopefully they do in conference, they are very, very many miles apart from each other. And that can be a little bit of a dynamic too. The first thing that Johnson has to do is get these individual spending bills across the line. And that's going to be the real big test in the weeks going forward for everyone to watch is, can he make peace with the Republicans who are not happy about this CR and get them to agree to pass the rules and pass the bills on the floor, which is what they need to do, okay? Republicans have to remember they have one half of one branch of government. Democrats run the White House and the Senate. And their best chance of leveraging some spending cuts and border security gains are to pass their bills first, to have a very solid position that gives them some negotiating room, and to force the Senate into giving them some wins.
Kate, we'll give you the last word, but the other thing that might change the dynamic and increase some pressure to get the job done here is a provision that was in the debt limit deal that was passed in May. And according to the reporting I'm seeing today is that the way that it's supposed to work is if these appropriations bills are not passed by January 1st, there's an automatic across the board 1% spending cut. And that cut won't go into effect into April. But there are already Republicans who are worried about the defense budget, defense hawks, who are saying that we cannot have this go into effect. We cannot have the Pentagon on top of this continuing resolution stuff we've been talking about, take a 1% across the board cut. That is not great news for the defense budget and those hawks. And many of them, I think, are concerned about it. However, there are also some members of Congress, Kate, who I think might be content to let those cuts take effect because what they're most concerned about is the spending.
I do worry about a return to sequester politics. You know, back in the early 2010s, the Budget Control Act succeeded in putting some fiscal discipline on domestic discretionary spending, but at a really great cost to defense that carved up the Pentagon's readiness and that came through in any number of metrics, including aircraft readiness rates and ships that were deploying too frequently and unable to get proper maintenance delays. I mean, so it really took a toll on the Pentagon over the 10 years it was in effect. And it really took basically the Trump cash infusion into the Pentagon was all aimed at dealing with that problem. And it took years to try to buy back some of that training and readiness that was lost over such a long period of time. So there is reason to worry about a return to that and a 1% cut across the board. Because to your point, there is a group of conservatives who would be fine with it. In fact, they might even think it needs to be deeper and would be comfortable including defense in that calculation. I think that would be a mistake for all the reasons we've talked about and the proliferating world threats. But I also think I would like to see Republicans put some more pressure on Democrats on getting a defense appropriations bill done. I mean, Democrats have spent trillions of dollars on domestic spending since the pandemic, and including Joe Biden's Inflation Reduction Act. And they're now trying to hold the defense appropriations hostage for more domestic spending. And so I think I would like to see Republicans at least try to press the case that that is really egregious and that the commander-in-chief has an obligation to set fiscal priorities. And that it's clear now that defense should be on that list. So I think there is clearly a bipartisan opportunity to get a defense appropriation done. And there should be more pressure on Democrats not to take it as a hostage.
Thank you, Kate and Kim. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.